Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 for Topic 4. All right, so what are we going to cover in this lecture? Well, in this lecture, we're going to look at how the court has defined religion, and we're also going to learn about this concept called the belief-action distinction. So let's get started. Okay, so we know through the first lecture that you listened to that religious practice receives constitutional protection through the First Amendment. But not all practices receive constitutional protection. Other practices are not protected by the First Amendment or any provision within the Constitution. And so, the question is how do we know whether or not a person's practice is actually motivated by their religious beliefs and therefore deserving of constitutional protection? And how do we know if their practices are not motivated by religious beliefs? Or maybe they say that they're motivated by religious beliefs, but only because they want some sort of benefit that the government could give them. They use a really good example in your textbook, the example of prisoners in a state-run prison. And, as we know that some people with religious beliefs have certain dietary practices, that if you are Jewish, that you eat kosher, and so that, or some Jewish folks eat kosher food. And so if you are a Jewish prisoner and that you consume kosher food, that the prison needs to respect your religious practice and give you kosher food. If you're Muslim, you also have food restrictions and preferences, that you cannot eat prohibited foods like pork, and you have to, that there are certain foods that that you can only eat if they're prepared a certain way through halal method. And so, if you're a prisoner and you're Muslim or you're Jewish, then, the prison has to make sure that you get that food because it's related to your religious practice. But then the example that they use in the textbook is about the prisoners who belong to the Church of Cabernet wine, and they're saying that their religious beliefs are that they must have at least once a week, right, a delicious bottle of Cabernet and filet mignon steaks, right? Sign me up for that religion. And they're demanding that the prison, that the state provides them with those foods because they say, hey, that's a part of our religious practice. Well, how do you know that that's a sham or not? I mean, how do you know whether the Church of Cabernet and the Church of Filet Mignon, how do you know if that's a real religion or not? And so, an example, another example is that, thinking about driver's license. That, when you make a driver's license, that you aren't supposed to wear a head covering, right? That there's a reason for that, because when you get pulled over, they want to be able to look at your driver's license and be able to clearly see your features so that they know that the person driving the car is the person on the license. But we do make exemptions for people who are wearing a head covering that is related to their religious beliefs. And so as you see there in the photograph, there's a woman there. She is practices the religion of Islam. She's a Muslim, and that one of the practices and the beliefs is that your hair should be covered, because that only those that you're really close to should be able to gaze upon your body. That your body is sacred and that it needs to be protected from the gaze of those who are not in alignment with religious beliefs. And so sometimes Muslim women will wear hijabs, and an exemption is made for them to wear their hijab in a driver's license photo. Now there's a picture of me up there and my baseball cap, right? And anybody who knows me knows that I'm a huge Brewers fan, watched, all the games, love going to this, to AmFam Field. If you knew me, you might be like, Margaret's an adherent to the Church of Baseball, right? Well, maybe I could go into the driver's license, the DMV, and say, hey, I'm a member of the Church of Baseball. That's my affiliation, and I should be given an exemption to wear my Brewers cap. Now, that's, sort of ridiculous, but, but from a non-ridiculous perspective, right, there are some religions that maybe nobody knows about, or that is not very well known, and their practices are a little strange and unusual. Well, the question is don't they deserve protection from the First Amendment as well? And so the problem is how do we differentiate between legitimate religious practices and those who are sham religious practices. Those are not really religious, but you're just exercising them so you can get that Cabernet and wine, or you can wear your baseball cap in your driver's license photo. Well, I used the driver's license photo as an example of differentiating between sham religions and real religions because that issue has actually come up. And as you can see there, that is a driver's license for the state of Massachusetts. And this is an individual. And if you look close at that picture, you might be saying, well, what's that individual wearing on their head? And the head covering is a colander. And so any of you who have ever made spaghetti, you boil it in the water and then you pour it out into a colander and you shake off all the water and then you eat your delicious spaghetti. Well, that individual is wearing a colander on their head because they are a member of Apostafarianism. And some of you might have heard of Apostafarianism. Apostafarianism is a secular religion that reviews the existence of the flying spaghetti monster to be just as probable as the existence of the Christian God. And so this is a group that is, they have a belief system, and that their belief system is about basically like calling into the question, whether or not God exists. And so, she wore this colander on her hat. And in fact, the courts in Massachusetts said that she had a right to do that they regarded Apostafarianism as a religious belief. And like other religious beliefs, it deserves constitutional protection. Now, early on, the courts would not have considered Apostafarianism a true religion, okay? However, today the court does. And as we know, the the court in Massachusetts, looking at existing definition of religion as the Supreme Court has outlined it, they looked at that definition, they applied it, and they said it meets that definition. Okay. So the way the court has defined religion has changed over time, because this person, wearing the colander, that would not be regarded as a protected religious practice, 100 years ago, or even less than 100 years ago. So let's look at how did the court get there? How did the court go from not, viewing Pastafarianism as a religion to viewing it as a religion today with full constitutional protections? Okay, so we can't figure out how the court got to the definition of religion that they use today without taking a look at some cases. So initially, the court defined religion really narrowly. And the first effort that the court makes to tackle this question of does this practice deserve constitutional protection comes from the case Davis v. Beeson from 1890. This is a case that has to do with a Mormon that Samuel Davis was a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, also known as people who are a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints are known as Mormons. And Mormonism is a really relatively new religion. It's an American religion. It was created in America by Joseph Smith. He's from New York in the 1840s. And then due to persecution, the Mormons, moved across the western, from the eastern part of the United States to the western part of the United States and settled in Utah. If you've ever been to Salt Lake City, it's Mormonism is, really entrenched in that area of the country. And Mormons were really looked down upon. They probably looked down upon today. I mean, you guys are probably too old to remember, but when Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012, I mean, his religion was called into question in part. And so, Davis v. Beeson is a case about Samuel D. Davis, that there was a law on the books in the Idaho territories. That's where he lived. And that the law basically said that in order to vote, that you had to make a pledge, you had to oath that if you were a Mormon, that you didn't practice polygamy. polygamy is no longer a religious doctrine of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, but it used to be. There was an idea that, one of the beliefs is that you should have many wives, and of the many wives, you should have many children, because then you're creating this wonderful family, like life after, you die in the after realm, and you'll be surrounded by many family members, right? And so there was this idea that you needed many children. But people look down on Mormons. People also look down on polygamy. And so in order to vote, you actually had to make an oath saying that you were not a practicing polygamist. And that's what Samuel Davis did. He really wanted to vote. He was a practicing polygamist, so he lied and he made the oath and he said, "No, I don't practice polygamy." And then he got in trouble for doing that. He was indicted and convicted for lying to federal officials, because Idaho was a federal territory at that time. And he said, "Look, that law infringed upon my religious my ability to freely practice my religion, and I shouldn't be forced to make an oath that is denying my religious practice, because that's protected by the United States Constitution." And so that question came before the court, and that they ultimately denied Davis's claim. They said that he was guilty as charged. But it's an important case because it allows us to see the first step that the Supreme Court took in terms of defining what is a religion. And so they said that in their ruling in this case, they said in the context of the First Amendment, religion refers primarily to one's views of his relationship to his creator. That religion is about recognizing the existence of God and have viewpoints regarding the relationship to God. So Mormonism, Church of the Latter-day Saint, is all about person's relationship to God. So Mormonism is viewed as a religion because it has to do with the relationship to God. But the court said that just because it's defined as a religion doesn't mean that it deserves constitutional protection, and we'll talk about that later in the lecture. But this is a pretty narrow definition of religion, because there are many religions today that don't believe in a God, right? I mean, it might believe in a life force, right? Some of the Asian religions, right? Buddhism, that it's not about humans' relationship to God, but it's something more abstract than that. But no one would doubt that Buddhism is a religion, a protected religion. But back in the day when this definition came out, it would not have been recognized as a religion. So, and neither would Apostafarianism, right? Because it's not about your relationship with God. And so we start this journey with a very limited definition, or very narrow definition of of how we define religion. The next case that helps us understand how the Supreme Court has defined religion comes about 50 years after the case we just talked about, the Davis case. And it comes to us in the case United States v. Ballard, and it has to do with this religious movement called the I Am movement. One thing you'll note as you're reading through the religious cases in Chapter 4 is that we really have minority religions that are not very popular, or new religions, to thank for defining what our religious liberties are. Because if you're a member of a religion that is quite common, like Catholicism or Methodist, today, people look at those religions and they view them as like, of course you're going to grant them religious protections because other people who are Catholic, or other people who are Jewish, or other people who are Methodist, right? But when it comes to like minority religions, that people can look at those religions and they think they're not religions, and they're not willing to extend those religious freedoms to those groups. So a lot of the case law that we have and that you'll be reading about comes from Mormons, comes from Seventh-day Adventists, comes from Jehovah's Witnesses, okay? And in this case, comes from a very small sect known as the I Am movement. This is a pretty cool case, and that it's the first case or significant case that the court hears following Davis, and this case leads the Supreme Court to offer a much broader definition of religion. So let me tell you a little bit about this case, and then you can read more about it in your textbook. And so in this picture, that's a picture of Guy Ballard and his wife Edna. And they were occultists, and they were, sort of interested in the spirit world from early on in their lives. And in the 1930s, they lived in California, and Guy Ballard was walking through the mountains that was near his house. And he was visited by a saint, Saint Germain. And so Saint Germain comes down to Guy Ballard. This is what Guy Ballard says, and that basically comes to him and says that we want you to Saint Germain points to Guy Ballard and says, we want you to be our divine messenger on Earth. I'm an ascendant master, and there are these other ascendant masters, and we're tapping you, Guy Ballard, to basically deliver the divine message of the ascendant masters to Earth, right? And so, basically, Guy Ballard viewed that he was the anointed one. And so then he creates the I am movement. It refers to Exodus, where God reveals himself to Moses and says, I am who I am. But you can also see it's a play on the words, I am the ascendant masters, AM there. And so he starts this movement and this religious organization. And then he realizes that he needs money. If he's going to be this divine messenger, he's going to need money in order to spread the word of the ascendant masters. And so he uses the United States Postal Service. He starts mailing out letters asking people to send money to him so that he can use that money in order to promote his religious organization. And the U.S. government, they don't look too kindly on that. They think that this is a sham. They think this is fraud, that they think that the I Am movement is a joke, and that Guy Ballard is just using that in order to defraud people of their money. And so he's charged with mail fraud, and he goes to trial. Now, during the course of his trial, that the judge, that after all the facts of the case are presented to, and the evidence is presented to the jury, that the judge basically gives the jury these jury instructions. And what the judge says is that when considering this case and whether or not Guy Ballard is guilty, he tells the jury, I don't want you to consider whether or not there's a truth in this religion, whether or not this religion is in fact true, but rather I want you to consider the sincerity of the beliefs that Guy Ballard is holding. That if you, the jury, find that he is sincerely believing in the I Am movement, then you cannot convict him, okay? But if you feel like he's not really sincerely holding this belief, then you can convict him of mail fraud. And so that he was acquitted of this. They said that the jury came back and said, indeed, these were sincerely held beliefs. And then that question about whether those were proper jury instructions went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court agreed with the judge who gave those jury's instructions. They basically said that that when you're testing whether or not someone is when you're trying to determine whether somebody's practice is motivated by their religious beliefs, that it's not the truth of the doctrine that should be examined, but rather the sincerity with which that belief is held. And if the jury felt that Guy Ballard was sincerely holding these beliefs, then it is indeed a religion. It's pretty wise, sort of a wise definition of religion. Because when you really sort of dig into even the most mainstream of religious beliefs, I was raised Catholic, right? And so virgin birth, right? That what's the truth of that? Could be true, maybe it's not true. Somebody dies and they raise from the dead 3 days after they died, right? I mean, sometimes when you look at the Trinity, right, that, three humans and, three things in one human, right? When you look at the truth of the doctrine, a religious doctrine, it can seem completely bizarro. And so the Supreme Court said, take that out of the mix. Do you hold it sincerely? If you hold that belief sincerely, then it is religion and it deserves constitutional protection. In the 1960s, we got an even broader definition of religion from the Supreme Court. And these questions came to the court because in the 1960s, the Vietnam War was going on and people were seeking religious exemptions from the draft, basically saying that their religious beliefs prohibited them from participating in the draft. And in fact, the Congress, there was a provision to allow people this religious exemption from fighting in a war. The problem is that the law that Congress passed in 1940, it said that yes, you could get an exemption from war service for religious reasons. But that they defined religion as a belief in a supreme being. So if your religion didn't recognize the existence of a supreme being, then you would not be eligible for an exemption from the draft. And that's the question that came to the court in U.S. v. Seeger. In this case, Daniel Seeger said that he could not fight in the war in Vietnam because of his religious beliefs. But he was honest and he said he wasn't absolutely sure about whether or not God existed, therefore making him ineligible for an exemption. So the question became before the court is whether or not you actually have to believe in the existence of supreme being for your set of beliefs to be considered a religion. So do you need to believe in God to get an exemption? And the Supreme Court said, no, you don't need to believe in a supreme being, in God, in order to have your belief system recognized as a religion. They said that if a religious belief occupies a place in a believer's life that is parallel to a belief in God, then it should be treated as a religion by the court and it deserves Supreme Court protection. You get further expansion in the 1970s. In this case, this was an individual who wasn't seeking religious exemption, but they were basically seeking an exemption because of their ideological point of view. The individual in this case was a pacifist. And so the question came before the court that can you get an exemption from the draft for an ideology or a political belief? And the court said yes, that ideologies are protected. If your belief system takes the same character as religion, then it's treated as religion. If it takes the same character in your life and it's sincerely held belief. So pacifism, humanism, communism, heck, maybe even at this point, the Church of Baseball could fit into this. I'm just kind of joking. Am I not? So at this point, we get a very, very broad definition of religion. It needs to be a sincerely held belief that plays a role in that person's life as if it was a religion. So it's a very, very broad definition that the court has created. And so that helps us understand why wearing a colander on your head and being a member of Apostafarianism is recognized as a religion by the court and deserving of First Amendment protections. So, as you learn, the court provides a very broad, inclusive definition of religion. But there are definitely some benefits for this definition. That if the definition of religion is way too narrow, then some religious beliefs that are clearly religious beliefs that they would not receive religious protection by the Constitution. But there are drawbacks too, because if you make the definition of religion so broad, it kind of makes a mockery of religion, right? So if Pastafarianism is given these protections from the First Amendment, kind of makes a mockery of people who really do have a religious belief, right? And, so wearing a colander becomes on par with wearing a hijab, and that could be really seen as insulting. However, it's probably just best for the court to have broad protection rather than narrow protection. Because if it's narrow, then it's very likely that somebody who really does have a strongly held religious belief, they might not be protected by the Constitution. So, overall, do you think it's a good definition? Is it good to have a broad definition like this, or would you like to see a more narrow definition of religion from the courts? Okay, the last thing we're talking about in this lecture is the belief-action distinction. So what is that? Well, the best way to understand it is to think about the First Amendment and the words that are in the First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So the question is does no law mean no law? In other words, can Congress, or as it gets applied to the states, can state never make a law prohibiting your free exercise of religion? Well, as you read in the textbook, the answer to that question is no. It is not taken literally. The court has never used a literal interpretation of the free exercise clause. Going back, as referenced in your textbook, Thomas Jefferson, in a famous letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, basically said that thoughts are protected absolutely, but actions are subject to government regulations. So when it comes to your religious beliefs, you can believe whatever you want. If you want to believe that you need to kill 3 people on a full moon, by using a special saber to slit their throat and drink their blood, go ahead and believe it, right? Your belief is absolutely protected. However, if you put that belief into action, that your actions can and should be, constrained by the government, because your actions can lead to the harm of others, particularly if you're sacrificing people in the name of your religion. And so the court has never literally interpreted the First Amendment or the free exercise clause, and in fact, they found that some religious activities do in fact lie beyond First Amendment protections. This comes into the court deals with this in the case Reynolds versus the United States. Reynolds is a case, again, about Mormons and practicing polygamy. Polygamy is forbidden. It's a crime to engage in polygamy at this time period. And George Reynolds, he marries his second wife, violating the federal law, and he is promptly arrested. In the case, he said, look, this is my religious practice. This is protected by the Constitution of the United States. And the court said no, that there is a belief action distinction. You can believe that you need to marry many wives, but that the state is well within its rights to regulate that, and that an individual can hold any religious beliefs, but when beliefs turn into action, government has the authority to regulate and even prohibit those actions. And that's established early on in Reynolds, and it's that belief action distinction is carried through as precedent for the rulings on the free exercise clause by the court. Okay, so we know that you can believe whatever you want when it comes to religion, but we also know that the court does allow for prohibitions and restrictions on your religious actions, okay? But the question is when is the government justified in its regulation of religious actions? In other words, when is religious action not protected by the First Amendment? And when is government not justified in regulating religious actions? In other words, when is religious action protected by the First Amendment? Well, it's up to the Supreme Court to give us guidance in terms of what religious action is protected by the First Amendment and what religious action falls outside of First Amendment protections. And so it's in the third lecture that we're going to be examining how the court figures this out. What is the standard they use, or what is the test that they use in order to determine what kind of religious action is protected and what kind of religious action is outside of First Amendment protection. And that's what we're going to cover in the next lecture. Thanks a lot for paying attention. Appreciate it. Talk to you again soon.